All right, thanking God once again for the chance to talk, God willing, accurately about his word, praying his blessings on that. But let's call Jeremiah chapter 24 very good in this chapter that contains a prophecy about two baskets of figs, starting out in verses 1 through 3, giving us context, saying that after the captivity of who I'm going to call Jehoiachin, the son of Jehoiakim, but he's going to have a number of names, among them Coniah and Jeconiah, as he's referred to in this chapter. But in the year or after he was taken into captivity by King Nebuchadnezzar, a vision came to Jeremiah about two baskets of figs placed in front of the temple, one basket being very good, the other being very bad. God asking Jeremiah, "What do you see?" To which he'll reply, not surprisingly enough, one basket of figs very good and another basket very bad. Verses 4 through 7, God will use to give him the reply or the interpretation. He will say that the basket of very good figs represents the exiled, presumably those mentioned at the beginning of the chapter, taken off with King Jehoiachin. Those he will treat favorably in spite of their exile because they will return to him with a whole heart. Verses 8 through 10, however, describing the remainder, the basket of very bad figs, as he will say, but Zedekiah and those who remain in the land, along with those who dwell in Egypt, will become a horror, a reproach, a byword, a taunt, and a curse to those who witness them or know of their predicament, saying that they will go on to the sword, famine, and pestilence until they are all utterly destroyed from the land, what we have referred to again as the promised land. Verses 4 through 7, however, speaking so well of the future that God had planned for the basket of good figs that I just want to take a moment to read it, beginning with verse 4. Then the word of the Lord came to me. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, like these good figs, so I will regard as good the exiles from Judah, whom I have sent away from this place to the land of the Chaldeans. I will set my eyes on them for good, and I will bring them back to this land. I will build them up and not tear them down. I will plant them and not uproot them. I will give them a heart to know that I am the Lord, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God, for they shall return to me with their whole heart. Understanding that much like Jehoiachin, the condemnation of the nation of Judah was pretty complete, but we've seen before that there is a remnant that God was still going to work with, not because they were perfect, but because in spite of their imperfections, God found redeeming qualities in them. Specifically, they were willing, like Jehoiachin, to simply surrender to God. Understanding that in all of the kings that oversaw Judah's fall or decline into captivity, Jehoiachin was the only one to actually surrender. And by the time you get to the end of the book of Jeremiah, the very last story in the entire book talks about the way in which Jehoiachin was actually released from prison and not simply freed, but he was allowed to eat at the king's table throughout the rest of his life, it seems. Understanding that he was not simply forgiven, quite possibly because of his surrender, God showed him grace and favor because he surrendered to God. Likewise, verses 4 through 7 describe the way in which God is not simply going to free those who surrendered, but whether in this generation or the next, after the 70 years of captivity, God is going to rebuild and restore those who genuinely surrendered not only themselves, but their whole heart to God. And at the risk of that term, surrender sounding cliche, I think the depth of its meaning is found in something we saw in the life of Moses, the one who was commended for doing all that God called him to do, all of it. Similar to what we saw out of King David during the days that he reigned in justice over Israel before he watered down his life with the sin against Uriah with his wife Bathsheba. Understanding that in spite of the way David famously compounded his adultery with a conspiracy to commit murder, God didn't simply make him king again. He restored him to the throne, not to languish in the same type of misery that marked Saul's decline, but in spite of all that he lost as a consequence of his sin, to have God restore him to much, if not all, of the honor he had before as king of Israel. After David restored himself to a complete, wholehearted commitment to following God. Not looking at God's counsel as a burden, but essentially the least David could do, understanding all that he had been forgiven and all that he had restored. David going beyond simply obeying the commands of God to look for other opportunities to bless the generations following. Understanding that even though he would not be allowed to build the temple, he went beyond mere obedience to preparing his son Solomon to not only build the temple, but to thrive as king of Israel.